What happens when a king sacrifices destiny for vanity? Alpha King Gerald Moreno had it all. Power, looks, a kingdom that bowed to his silver-haired glory. But he rejected his one true mate, Janet Hill Wise, humiliating her and branding her Barren in front of the entire alliance. He exiled her to the rogue lands to die, choosing instead a politically connected queen who could give him the worthy heir his ego demanded. 6 years later, he's celebrating the birth of his new son. Drunk on his own vindication, Gerald sends Janet an invitation to the pup naming ceremony, a final cruel act to mock the barren mate he discarded. But he made one mistake. He didn't know. She was already pregnant when she left, and she isn't coming back alone. The envelope was heavy, expensive parchment that carried the scent of imported leather and winter sage, the signature fragrance of the Moreno Highland citadel. It felt like a weapon in Janet's hands, a blade from a life she had bled her way out of 6 years ago. It wasn't addressed to Alpha Janet, a title she'd carved out with her own claws in the brutal rogue territories. It wasn't even addressed to Mrs. Hill Wise, the name she used in the quiet border settlement where humans asked no questions. It was addressed to the barren defect. Her jaw clenched, the paper creaked in her grip. Even without breaking the silver wax seal, she knew exactly who it was from. Only one man was that vain, that petty, that he'd send a letter across 2 territories just to twist the knife. "Mama?" Janet's entire body softened instantly. She set the envelope down on the worn oak table of her cottage as if it were contaminated and turned. Ezekiel, her eldest by 4 minutes, stood in the archway of the small bedroom, one hand rubbing sleep from his dark eyes. At only 5 years old, he was already tall for his age, his black hair falling in waves that caught the firelight, and his face. Goddess, his face. The sharp cheekbones, the aristocratic nose, the way he held his chin even when uncertain. It was all him. A miniature, devastating echo of Gerald Moreno. "I'm right here, love," Janet murmured, crossing to him and brushing his hair back with gentle fingers. "Go back to bed. The sun isn't even thinking about rising yet." "Tobias keeps kicking," Ezekiel mumbled, but his intelligent gaze, too sharp for a child, was locked on the envelope. "What's that?" "Nothing important, Zeke," Janet said lightly, guiding him back toward the bedroom door, where she could hear the quiet breathing of his 2 brothers. "Just junk mail." He didn't look convinced. His nostrils flared slightly. Already his wolf senses were developing faster than they should. "It smells wrong," he said, his small voice dropping to something almost dangerous. "It smells like him." Janet's heart stopped. Her sons had never met Gerald Moreno. She had never spoken his name in their presence, never shown them a single portrait, never even mentioned the kingdom she'd been exiled from. But blood knew blood. The ancient power that ran through Gerald's veins, the Moreno gift that made Alpha's bow and enemies flee. It recognized itself, even in sleep, even across miles and years of silence. "Zeke, don't lie to me, Mama." His voice cracked slightly, and suddenly he wasn't a future Alpha. He was just a scared little boy who sensed a threat to his mother. "Is he coming for us?" Janet knelt down, eye level with her son, and placed both hands firmly on his small shoulders. "No one," she said, her voice low and absolute, "is coming for us. No one is taking you from me. Do you understand?" Ezekiel searched her face, his dark eyes, Gerald's eyes, glinting with something old and fierce. Finally he nodded. "Promise?" "I promise." He hugged her quickly, fiercely, then padded back into the bedroom. Janet waited until she heard the rustle of blankets, the quiet murmur of Tobias asking if everything was okay, Ezekiel's reassurance that it was just Mama checking on them. Only then did Janet return to the table. Only then did she pick up the envelope again. Only then did she break the seal. Inside, in Gerald's sharp, slanted handwriting, "You are cordially commanded to attend the naming ceremony of His Royal Highness, Prince Lucian Moreno, firstborn son and true heir to the Highland throne, born of His Majesty Alpha King Gerald Moreno and Her Majesty Queen Seraphine Moreno. Your presence is requested so that you may bear witness to the glorious continuation of the royal bloodline, a blessing the moon goddess bestows only upon the fertile and the worthy." And then, scrawled at the bottom in Gerald's own hand, the real message. "Come see what a real queen looks like, Janet. Come see the son a true mate gave me. Consider it closure for your unfortunate situation." Janet read it once, twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the table, as if any sudden movement might make her do something rash, like burn it, or scream, or laugh until she cried. Gerald wanted closure. Gerald wanted to parade his perfect queen and his true heir in front of the woman he'd branded defective. Gerald wanted to rub salt in a wound he thought was still raw. He had no idea that the barren defect he'd thrown away had given birth to 3 sons on a frozen floor in a stranger's barn, screaming through the worst pain of her life with no one to hold her hand, no one to tell her she'd survive. No idea that those 3 sons were stronger, faster, more powerful than any alpha pup born in the last century. No idea that they carried his bloodline, the true Moreno gift, and that she'd spent 6 years teaching them to hide it, to bury it, to never let anyone see what they really were. And he certainly had no idea that she'd just been given the perfect opportunity to show him exactly what he'd thrown away. Janet stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark forest beyond her cottage, at the small, hidden life she'd built from nothing. She thought about Gerald's smug face. She thought about the queen who'd taken her place. She thought about the Alliance Alphas who'd watched her exile and done nothing. And then she thought about her 3 sons sleeping in the next room, Ezekiel with his father's face, Tobias with his father's voice, and Matthias with his father's eyes, the true heirs to the Highland throne. And Gerald had just invited her to bring them home. A slow, cold smile spread across Janet's face. "Closure," she whispered to the darkness. "Oh, Gerald, you have no idea what kind of closure you just asked for." She picked up the invitation one more time, studying the silver wax seal, the embossed crest, the elegant script. Gerald wanted a show. Fine. She'd give him one he'd never forget. 6 years ago, Janet Hill Wise had stood in that same great hall, 22 years old and terrified, wearing a simple white dress. The mate bond had hummed through her veins like electricity, pulling her toward the silver-haired man on the throne, Gerald Moreno, newly crowned Alpha King. She'd thought the moon goddess had blessed her, a nobody from a border pack, with the ultimate gift. She'd been devastatingly wrong. The summons had come after 6 months of marriage, 6 months of Gerald's cold distance, his calculating stares, his barely concealed impatience every time he looked at her still, flat stomach. She'd felt the nausea that morning, but had been too nervous to recognize what it meant. The throne room had been full. Every alpha in the Alliance stood witness. Gerald had sat on his throne in full military regalia, looking like a god carved from ice and arrogance. Dr. Brennan, the royal physician, had stepped forward with a scroll that might as well have been her death warrant. "Your Majesty," he'd said, not looking at Janet, "the tests are conclusive. The Luna is barren, incapable of producing an heir." The word had echoed. "Barren! Barren! Barren!" Janet had grabbed Gerald's arm, desperate. "No, Gerald, please, it's not true. I feel different, I think. We're mates. The goddess wouldn't—" He'd looked at her hand on his pristine blue sleeve like she was something diseased. Then he'd shaken her off with such force she'd stumbled. "A barren mate is no mate at all," he'd declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "She's a defect, a mistake. I, Alpha King Gerald Moreno, reject you, Janet Hill Wise, as my mate and Luna." The bond hadn't just broken. It had shattered like glass inside her chest, every shard tearing through her soul. She'd collapsed, screaming, clutching her stomach as the court watched with cold, judgmental eyes. "Guards, remove this failure from my sight. She is exiled to the Rogue Lands. If she ever returns to Moreno territory, she dies." They'd dragged her past Seraphine Blackwood's triumphant smile, past Gerald's already dismissive gaze, out into the cold where she'd been thrown onto a cart and dumped at the border like garbage. She'd been 6 weeks pregnant, with triplets. Present day, Janet stared at Gerald's invitation, her hand steady now where it had once trembled. She thought of that girl in the white dress, broken and bleeding on a cart. She thought of giving birth alone in a freezing barn, convinced she was dying, bringing 3 perfect sons into the world through sheer spite and willpower. She thought of Gerald's face when he saw them. The moon goddess hadn't made a mistake 6 years ago. Gerald had. And tomorrow, in front of that same court, that same crowd of alphas, Janet was going to make sure everyone knew it. She walked to her son's bedroom door and watched them sleep. 3 dark-haired princes who would shake a kingdom. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we go home." The dress hung in Janet's modest wardrobe like a declaration of war. Deep wine-colored silk that caught the light like spilled blood, with long fitted sleeves and a neckline that spoke of queens, not exiles. She'd commissioned it 3 years ago for the day she might need to look like someone who mattered. She'd never imagined she'd wear it to face Gerald. "Mama, why are you crying?" Janet turned from the wardrobe to find all 3 of her sons standing in the doorway, identical expressions of concern on their small faces. She hadn't realized tears were sliding down her cheeks until Tobias pointed them out. "I'm not sad, baby," she said, wiping her eyes quickly. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're getting ready to do something brave. Are we going somewhere?" Matthias asked, his dark eyes, Gerald's eyes, too perceptive for a 5-year-old. Janet took a breath. She'd protected them from the truth for so long, hidden them from a world that would either worship or destroy them. But that ended today. "Yes, we're going to meet someone important." "The man from the letter," Ezekiel said flatly. Not a question. A statement. "Yes. Our father." Still flat, still too knowing. Janet knelt down so she was eye level with all 3 of them. "He doesn't know about you. He threw me away before I knew you existed. He thinks I'm broken, useless. He sent that invitation to hurt me." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm going to show him exactly how wrong he was." Matthias tilted his head. "By bringing us? By bringing you?" The boys exchanged glances, that eerie, silent communication that triplets sometimes shared. Finally, Ezekiel nodded. "What do we wear?" Janet smiled through her tears and pulled 3 matching outfits from the chest she'd prepared last night. White tunics with black embroidered collars, formal and princely, the kind of clothing that screamed nobility even without a crest. She'd stitched them herself over the past 3 years, always hoping she'd never need them, always knowing someday she would. "We match," Tobias said, holding his tunic up to his brothers. "Like a pack." "Like a family," Janet corrected softly. She dressed them with careful hands, buttoning each black collar, smoothing each white sleeve. They stood in a line before her mirror, 3 identical princes with their father's aristocratic features and their mother's fierce determination. Then Janet slipped into the wine-red dress. The silk whispered against her skin like a promise. She'd been a girl in white when Gerald destroyed her. She'd be a woman in red when she destroyed him. She pulled her blonde hair back in a severe style that exposed her face, her scars, everything she'd survived. No hiding, no shame. "How do we look?" Ezekiel asked. Janet stared at their reflection, a mother and her 3 sons, dressed like they were going to war disguised as a ceremony. "Like we're about to change everything," she said. And they were. Alpha Marcus Thorne's territory bordered the rogue lands, and unlike most alphas, he didn't see rogues as vermin. He saw them as wolves Gerald's cruelty had created. Janet had saved his sister from a bear trap 2 years ago. Marcus had said he owed her a debt. Now, standing at his manor with her 3 sons, she was calling it in. Marcus opened the door himself, massive with iron-grey hair and scars from battles won. His eyes swept over Janet's wine-red dress, then dropped to the boys. His pupils widened slightly as he caught their scent. "Goddess," he breathed. "Those are Moreno blood." Janet finished quietly. "All 3 of them." Marcus stepped back, gesturing them inside. His study was all dark wood and weapons mounted on walls, the room of a warrior who'd earned his power through strength, not politics. He poured himself a drink without offering her one. His hand shook slightly as he raised the glass. "Gerald rejected you 6 years ago," he said finally. "Called you Barren before the entire alliance." He did. "And now he's celebrating his new son, inviting you to mock you." "He is." Marcus looked at the boys again. They stood in a perfect line, backs straight, faces solemn. Ezekiel met the Alpha's stare without flinching. "How old are they?" 5. "So you were already 6 weeks pregnant when he exiled me." The doctor lied. Gerald's new queen paid him to lie. Janet's voice was ice. "I'm going to walk into that naming ceremony, Marcus. I'm going to show Gerald and every Alpha in the Alliance exactly what he threw away. But I can't do it alone. He'll have me killed before I reach the throne room. You want my protection. I want your escort, your alliance. You have every right to attend a royal ceremony. If I walk in under your banner, he can't touch me without declaring war on you." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Gerald Moreno stole a trade route from me 3 years ago, claimed it was territorial adjustment. I've been waiting for a chance to make him pay." He set his glass down with deliberate care. "I'll do better than escort you, Janet. I'll sponsor you. I'll walk you down that hall myself, and I'll make sure every Alpha there knows these boys carry the true Moreno bloodline. That will destroy any chance of peace between your territories." "Good." Marcus's smile sharpened. Gerald's been king long enough. Time someone reminded him that crowns can be lost as easily as they're won. Janet felt something loosen in her chest. She wasn't walking into the lion's den alone anymore. "When do we leave?" Marcus asked. "Dawn," Janet said. "We want to arrive exactly as the ceremony begins." Dramatic. Gerald wanted a show. She looked down at her sons, at their fierce young faces. "I'm going to give him one he'll never forget." The great hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off polished stone and jewels adorning every Alpha packed into the space. At the center, on a raised dais beneath ancient banners, stood Gerald Moreno in full ceremonial regalia. He was magnificent. His military uniform was sapphire blue with silver braiding that caught the light like captured lightning. His famous silver hair swept back from a face carved by gods themselves. Handsome, powerful, utterly convinced of his own perfection. In his arms, wrapped in white silk, lay the infant Prince Lucian. And beside him, radiant in emerald green, stood Queen Seraphine with her practiced smile. Gerald raised his crystal goblet, and the hall fell silent. "My friends," His voice carried effortlessly, rich and commanding. "Today we celebrate not just my son's birth, but the continuation of the Moreno bloodline. For too long this pack has waited for a worthy heir." His gaze swept the crowd. They all remembered Janet. "But the moon goddess corrects her mistakes. She has blessed me with a true queen and a perfect son. The future of our kingdom is secure." He lifted the baby higher, and the crowd erupted in applause. Janet stood in the entrance corridor with Marcus at her side, listening to every word through the heavy oak doors. Her sons flanked her, 3 small figures in white and black, their faces unreadable. "A mistake," Ezekiel whispered, his young voice tight with fury. "He called you a mistake." "He did." Janet's hand found his shoulder, squeezed gently. "And in about 30 seconds, he's going to learn exactly how wrong he is." Inside, Gerald was still speaking, drunk on his own triumph. "So I ask you to raise your glasses to Prince Lucian, to Queen Seraphine, and to the glorious future of—" The doors exploded inward. Not literally, though the sound of ancient oak slamming against stone might as well have been a detonation. Every head in the hall whipped toward the entrance. The applause died like a candle in a hurricane. Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway, a mountain of a man in his formal blacks, his presence alone a challenge. But every eye slid past him to the woman who stepped through next. Janet Hill-Wise walked into the hall like she owned it. The wine-red dress flowed around her like liquid fire, her blonde hair severe and perfect, her spine straight as a blade. She wasn't the broken girl they remembered. She was something else entirely, something dangerous. But it was the 3 boys who made the room gasp. 3 identical children in white and black, walking in perfect formation behind their mother, their dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, their young faces set with an ancient dignity that didn't belong on 5-year-olds. Gerald's goblet slipped from his fingers. It shattered on the marble floor, red wine spreading like blood at his feet. And in the sudden, suffocating silence, Janet smiled. "Hello, Gerald," she said. "Did you miss me?" For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then Janet took her first step forward, and the spell shattered. The crowd parted like water before a blade. Janet walked down the center aisle with her head high, her wine-red dress catching the candlelight. Behind her, Marcus Thorne followed like a silent promise of violence. And flanking her, her 3 sons walked in perfect synchronization. Gerald stood frozen on his dais, his face drained of color. Queen Seraphine had gone pale, her emerald dress garish against bloodless skin. Only the baby made any sound, a soft gurgle of infant ignorance. Janet reached the base of the dais and stopped. She didn't bow. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply stood there and waited. Then Ezekiel, Tobias, and Matthias stepped forward to stand directly in front of their mother, forming a wall of white and black between her and the king. 3 pairs of eyes, dark, intelligent, and utterly fearless, stared up at Gerald Moreno. Someone in the crowd gasped. Another whispered a prayer to the moon goddess. Because now, with the 4 of them standing together at the foot of the throne, the image was complete and devastating. Gerald on his dais in sapphire and silver, his famous white hair gleaming under the candlelight. Janet below in wine red, her blonde hair like spun gold. And between them, the 3 boys, dark-haired, aristocratic, with features that were an undeniable blend of both parents. The visual truth was inescapable. Undeniable. Lord Castellan, standing in the front row, made a strangled sound. Lady Morgrave clutched her pearls. Even the Blackwood family, who had helped orchestrate Janet's exile, looked stricken. "What is this?" Gerald's voice cracked on the last word, all his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "What are you doing here?" "You invited me," Janet said calmly. Her voice carried through the hall with perfect clarity. "You sent me a very specific invitation, Gerald. You wanted me to witness the continuation of your bloodline. You wanted me to see what a true queen looks like." She gestured to her sons. "So here I am, witnessing." Gerald's eyes fixed on the boys, really fixed on them for the first time. She watched him catalogue every detail, the sharp jaw lines, the aristocratic noses, the way they held themselves with natural authority, the way Tobias had Gerald's exact stance, the way Matthias had his mother's defiant chin, the way Ezekiel had, both their stubborn pride written across his young face. "Who are they?" Gerald whispered, though everyone in the hall could hear him. Janet smiled. It was the coldest thing in the room. "You called me Barren, Gerald. You humiliated me, exiled me. You told the entire alliance I was a mistake the moon goddess needed to correct." She placed a hand on each of her outer sons' shoulders. "These are your corrections. Meet Ezekiel, Tobias, and Matthias." Her smile sharpened into something deadly. "Your firstborn sons." The hall erupted. The chaos lasted 7 seconds before Gerald's voice cut through it like a whip. "Silence." The hall obeyed instantly. But the tension remained, thick enough to choke on. Gerald's shock was transforming into something uglier. His lip curled as he looked down at Janet. "Firstborn sons?" His laugh was sharp, mocking. "Is this your revenge? You bring 3 rogue bastards into my hall and claim they're mine. Did you really think you could walk in here with some purchased children and— Look at them." Janet's voice was quiet, but it cut through his tirade. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Look at them, Gerald." Something in her tone made him stop, made him actually look. Not at the boys as a group, not as props in whatever scheme he thought she was running, but at them individually. He started with Ezekiel. Dark hair that fell in waves exactly like Gerald's had at that age. A jawline showing the aristocratic sharpness of the Moreno line. Eyes that held an intensity Gerald saw in his own mirror. Then Tobias in the center. The way he stood with arms crossed, Gerald felt ice slide down his spine because he stood exactly the same way. The boy's nose, the set of his mouth, the slight head tilt when evaluating a threat. Finally, Matthias, the most delicate features of the 3, almost beautiful, with his mother's defiant chin and his father's penetrating stare. He smiled when Gerald's gaze landed on him, and it was the smile of someone who knew a secret. Gerald's great-grandfather had smiled exactly like that in the portrait hanging in the royal library. "No," Gerald whispered, but his voice had lost all its certainty. "Count them," Janet said softly. 3 sons, Gerald. Triplets, born 6 months after you exiled me, 9 months from our last night together. Lord Castellan was doing the math in his head, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. Other alphas were following suit, whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd like spreading poison. Gerald's hands had started to shake. The baby, Prince Lucian, began to fuss, sensing his father's distress, but Gerald barely noticed. He was staring at the 3 boys, seeing not just his own features reflected back at him, but his father's features, his grandfather's. The Moreno bloodline stretching back 1,000 years, undeniable and damning. "They have your grandfather's eyes," Queen Seraphine breathed from beside him, her voice filled with dawning terror. "Gerald, they have the Moreno eyes. The ancient bloodline marker, the trait that appeared only in true Moreno heirs, skipping generations but always returning. The slight golden flecks in otherwise dark irises that caught the light like coins at the bottom of a well. All 3 boys had them. Gerald's knees buckled. He caught himself on the arm of his throne, his perfect posture crumbling. The hall had gone so silent that everyone heard his next words, broken and devastated. Goddess, help me. They're mine. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Gerald was still gripping his throne when Janet's voice cut through the silence. Dr. Brennan. Every head swiveled to find the royal physician, a thin man in healer's robes who had suddenly gone the colour of old parchment. His eyes darted to the exits, to Queen Seraphine, to anywhere but Janet's stare. Step forward, Doctor. It wasn't a request. Brennan's feet moved before his mind could stop them, shuffling through the crowd like a condemned man. 6 years ago, Janet said, you declared me barren. You examined me. You claimed. You told Gerald I was incapable of bearing children. She gestured to her sons. I would like to know how you reached that conclusion. Brennan's mouth opened and closed. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The tests were... It was a medical... Were there tests, Dr. Brennan? Yes, of course there were. What tests? The question was simple. Deadly. Brennan's eyes went wild, searching for support, for escape, for any way out of the trap closing around him. Queen Seraphine had gone rigid in her emerald dress, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Then something shifted, a pressure that made everyone step back. The 3 boys had tilted their heads in perfect unison. Their eyes, those Moreno eyes, fixed on the doctor with an intensity that didn't belong on 5-year-olds. Power radiated from them, raw alpha power that pressed down on the hall like a physical weight. At its epicenter was Dr. Brennan, who began to visibly tremble. The truth, Ezekiel said softly. His voice was a child's voice, but the command in it was ancient. Tell her. Brennan's resistance crumbled like sand. There were no tests. He gasped, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I never examined her. I was paid. 20,000 gold pieces, paid to lie, to say she was barren, to make sure the king rejected her. The hall erupted in chaos, but Janet's voice rose above it. Paid by whom? Brennan's trembling finger lifted, pointing at Queen Seraphine. She came to me a week before the examination. She said the king needed a proper queen from a noble house, someone who could bring political alliances. His voice broke. She threatened my family if I didn't comply. My daughter. Lies! Seraphine shrieked, her composure shattering. He's lying. He's been paid by her to say these things. Guards, arrest him! But no one moved. Every eye in the hall was fixed on the queen, seeing her not as she'd presented herself, regal, perfect, untouchable, but as what she truly was. You bought a false diagnosis, Lord Castellan said slowly, his voice heavy with disgust. You destroyed a true mate bond for political gain. Gerald still hadn't moved from his half-collapsed position on the throne. He stared at Seraphine as if seeing her for the first time, and what he saw made something die behind his eyes. The confession hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. Seraphine's denials died as she saw condemnation in every face. But Gerald hadn't moved. He remained frozen, staring at the woman he'd made his queen. Then the baby in his arms began to cry. Prince Lucian wailed, cutting through the silence. Gerald looked down at the white silk bundle. Really looked for the first time since Janet had entered. He inhaled. The baby's scent filled his nostrils. Milk and innocence, and something wrong. Every wolf knew their own blood by scent. It was primal, instinctive. A father could identify his child in a room of hundreds. This child didn't smell like him. Gerald's eyes snapped to Seraphine, her face a mask of horror. Whose? His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the hall. Gerald, please. Whose? The roar shook the rafters. Several nobles stumbled backward. The 3 boys at Janet's side didn't flinch. Gerald's senses were fully engaged now, hunting. His gaze landed on a figure near the back wall. A man in plain brown uniform who had gone pale as death. Captain Royce, the Queen's personal guard, the man who accompanied her on morning rides, who stood outside her chambers when Gerald was away. Gerald inhaled again, pulling in both scents, the baby's and the guard's. They matched. Salt and cedar, the particular warmth that marked bloodline. Undeniable. "No," Gerald whispered, then louder, his voice breaking. "No, no, no!" He thrust the baby at Seraphine so violently she nearly dropped it. She caught Prince Lucian with a strangled cry, backing away as Gerald rose to his full height. His handsome face had transformed into something terrible. "You—" Gerald's finger stabbed toward Seraphine, trembling with rage. "You destroyed my true mate. You paid to have her declared barren. You threatened a physician's child. You made me exile the mother of my heirs." His voice dropped to something deadly quiet. "And you did it all to put another man's bastard on my throne." Seraphine clutched the baby to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "It was supposed to be yours. I tried, Gerald, I tried, but you were always so cold to me, always comparing me to her. Get out. Gerald, please, get out of my sight." The command hit like a physical blow. Seraphine staggered, her emerald dress suddenly looking like a costume on a stage actress whose performance had ended. Two guards moved forward hesitantly, unsure. "Take her to the tower," Gerald said, his voice now terrifyingly calm. "Take the captain as well. They will await trial for treason, fraud, and conspiracy against the crown." As the guards moved to obey, Gerald finally turned to face Janet. His silver hair seemed to have lost its luster. His sapphire uniform looked like chains. The king stood before the woman he'd destroyed, and for the first time in 6 years saw clearly what he'd done. "Janet," he whispered. "Goddess help me. What have I done?" The guards escorted Seraphine and Captain Royce from the hall. The assembled court watched. Then every eye turned back to the dais where Gerald stood alone, looking less like a king and more like a man standing in ruins. He descended the steps slowly, each one costing him something. His silver hair no longer gleamed. His uniform looked like a costume for a part he'd never understood. Janet watched him approach, her 3 sons forming a protective wall. Marcus Thorne shifted, ready to intervene, but Janet raised a hand. Gerald stopped 3 paces away, close enough to see the woman he'd destroyed, what 6 years had forged her into, something harder, something he couldn't damage again. "Janet." His voice cracked. "I didn't know. About them. About any of it." He looked at the boys, desperate. "I have sons, true heirs, and I threw you all away for a lie." "You did," Janet said simply. "Let me fix this, please. We can repair the mate bond. You and the boys can live here. I'll give you everything. Titles, wealth, position. They'll be recognized as princes. You'll be my Luna again. My queen." "Your what?" Janet's voice was ice. "Your property. Your second choice." "My mate." The words exploded from Gerald, raw and desperate. "You're my mate. The moon goddess chose you for me. Those are my sons. That's my blood, my family." The word hung between them. Family. Janet looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been everything to her once, who had called her barren, defective, a mistake, who had exiled her to die rather than question a single piece of paper. She drew her sons back against her, forming a unit Gerald was not part of. "You chose your family 6 years ago, Gerald. You chose power over love, politics over the mate bond, a false queen over a true mate." She pulled her sons closer. "I chose mine." Gerald's face crumpled. "Please, don't take my sons." "They were never yours to take. You rejected them before they drew their first breath. I brought them into this world alone. I kept them alive. I taught them to be strong." She smiled, cold and final. "You wanted to mock the barren reject. That woman is dead. I killed her the day I realized I didn't need your validation to know my worth." She turned her back on him, on the throne, on everything she might have been. "Marcus," she said quietly. Alpha Marcus Thorne stepped forward. The three boys fell into formation, and together they walked toward the doors. "Janet!" Gerald's voice was broken, desperate. "Janet!" She didn't look back. Behind her, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses to his shame, Alpha King Gerald Moreno fell to his knees and wept. The Barren reject walked out into the morning light with her head high, her sons at her sides, and the entire future of the kingdom in her hands. The doors closed behind her with a sound like finality itself.